Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we're going to be talking about a controversial topic. Is the West losing Russia? That's not typically the way the question is formulated, as some of you have already pointed out in the live chat, but I'm intentional about putting it that way. Before we get into it, some preliminaries. I am at a family weekend house where the internet has been proven to be very unreliable. We have given more money to the internet company. We have purchased new equipment. We've got new range extenders, and I am now jacked in by Ethernet. My hope is that we will be able to make it all the way through this without problems. That was not the case on the patrons only live chat at the end of last week, and I apologize to the patrons for that. We only managed to make it to like an hour and 40 minutes. I'm guessing that there may be that kind of cutoff again, so I'll try to run through the presentation a little more quickly than last time, so we have more time for Q&A and, well, more time for super chats, which I appreciate and keep me fed. Also, if you're new to this, what happens is I do a presentation for half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, and then we do Q&A. Then we do question and answer period. And if you have any questions, please save them for that question and answer period or discuss that among yourselves in the live chat. And just remember to ask me those questions again when the Q&A period starts. We have very few restrictions on what you can say in this live chat. We're not a particularly politically correct place. The one exception that we make is that you are not allowed to abuse each other. That includes Logo, the moderator. Do not be abusive to each other. Do not be abusive to the chat. You can say whatever the hell you want about me and my weird beard and stupid haircut and my ideas and how dumb they are and how I'm terribly racist against the Greeks. Whatever comes to mind about me, have at it. Have fun. Just do not be abusive of other people in the chat and do not disrupt the quality of the chat. If you're just posting the same thing over and over and over again, Logo will warn you, and then if you keep doing it, Logo will block you. So don't do that. We're already having some trouble. Technically, I can't actually see the chat at this point. When I jump over to the Q&A period, I've got my phone, so I'll be able to look at the chat there. Yeah, I totally can't see what you're doing, so it is in Logo's hands, and please listen to him. All right. So is the West losing Russia? This is, as has already been pointed out in the live chat so far, this is not the way the question is typically stated. It's usually, is the West losing Syria to Russia? Is the West losing Libya to Russia? Is the West losing the Middle East to Russia? And more ridiculous formulations is the US losing Venezuela to Russia? And I think it's just necessary for there to be a serious reformulation of how we think about Russia in the United States to a large extent, in Europe to some extent, but I think they're actually, as we'll get into here, they've already sort of begun to do that reformulation. And it's the realization that needs to be made is that Russia is not like a major player in world geopolitics. Russia is a battleground. And I'm going to keep saying that over and over again, but that's what I want to emphasize today. It's not, Russia is not what it once was. If in fact Russia ever was what it once was, it is not a superpower. It is not a great power. It is barely a regional power. And I just want to emphasize just how stupid it is the way that in US politics, Russia is still held up as this incredible, scary bad guy that justifies all of our military budgets, justifies hatred for Trump that shouldn't need to be justified, and stuff like that. So just sort of like to go into it, I mean, this is something that is historically based in the European, not just in the American imagination, but in sort of the European imagination or the imagination of the West, writ more broadly. Russia has been the scary guy since the mid 1700s. This is the scary, Eastern different place. It's Oriental despotism. They're based on slaves. Because they did have serfs into the 1850s. It's all, it's this scary evil place. Yada yada. I mean, this was just a really prominent part of the Western imagination sort of European and American thinking for a very long time. And then, as Russia continued to modernize and used what used to be a dramatically larger population than any other country in the West to start leveraging power, this old fear became bigger and bigger and bigger. Of course, the two great examples of Russia sort of exerting its power would be in the Napoleonic Wars, when the Russians essentially won that for everybody, and then in World War II, when the Russians essentially won that for everyone. So, I mean, Russia was a very serious country for a very, very long time, and it throughout the Cold War, Russia through different means, as the Soviet Union, it controlled everything up to the border with, I suppose, Poland and Poland and Yugoslavia directly, and then through the Warsaw Pact, it controlled more or less with Russian soldiers on the soil of other countries up until like midway through Germany, up and through East Germany. So the Soviet Union was a real threat, though I do think I talk about in my book, Avoiding the British Empire, which you should all look into, comparing the US and British empires and the ways that the US is making the same mistakes that the British Empire is, carrot and plug. But yeah, Avoiding the British Empire, good book to look into. I talk a lot about how Russia maybe wasn't really ever as much of a threat as it was cracked up to be for political purposes. I talk about the great game between Britain and Russia in the 19th century, this idea that everything the British Empire was doing to expand its sort of Indian and Asian empire was justified because, the scary Russians were just over the horizon. And this is a story that still gets trotted out in popular, survey history books. There's the Silk Roads book that you can find in every by some British academic. You can find in every airport. Every airport in the English-speaking world, it has really evocative passages about the burgeoning threat of the Russian colossus from the east and from the west. Now the British had to build up in the Great Game, and it's all horseshit. If you actually look at sort of the details of what Russia, the kinds of force that Russia was able to exert, it's true that Russia, made serious forays into Central Asia in ways that were very scary looking if you didn't look at the numbers of troops that were involved. It conquered, Khiva and Bokhara and essentially the modern stands with expeditionary forces of like 3,000 or 4,000 people, and at great expense and great complexity. It didn't have a railroad that made it across. Russia didn't have a railroad that made it all the way across the country until I think 1910, 1915, and it was even later that the railroad network linked up in ways that could get the Soviet forces even to the border of, the Russian forces even to the border of British India. And as we saw in Afghanistan in the 1980s, even with those railroad connections and the second most impressive military in the world at that time, they couldn't quite make it through Afghanistan. British India, which anyway, that's too much. That's a bit of an exaggeration, a bit off topic, and we're trying to go short here. And also, there's it's something that's not pointed out particularly often is just how terrible Russia's record is in terms of foreign adventuring, and I mean across the centuries. They did pretty great under Peter the Great. They did manage to beat up Sweden and take a lot of what sort of was their territory between the 1700s until 1989, talking about the Baltic states and elements of Poland. That's a dramatic oversimplification, but the Russians generally, I mean, I guess there was Suvorov who was okay, but the two big, Russia rolling across Europe and crushing an evil dictator, Napoleon in 1813, 1814, and Hitler in 1944, 45. Russia was able to do that with their extraordinary manpower, starting from, well, I guess not on those years, but with their extraordinary manpower and weight, economic and weight of material, but also with the complete support of every other power in the world at that time. The question of whether Russia would have been able to roll up Napoleon without the Prussians, the Austrians, the British is a pretty open one. The question of Russia, would Russia have been able to roll up Hitler without the Americans, the British? I mean, that's enough. Is an open question. So this idea that Russia has been this sort of this specter haunting Europe and this massively impressive world power forever, I think needs to be taken with a grain of salt. I think one of the best examples would be their disastrous performance in World War One. I mean, everyone, all the allies, France expected, Germany expected Russia to be, a tremendously intimidating actor in World War One, and it was not. It just got it. I mean, it just got its ass kicked like over and over and over again. And there's like one offensive or two where Russians were like, hey, no, look, that was cool, that could have worked out better, and then it didn't, because the offensive after that was crushed. So yeah, it's the Russians were never that intimidating. And now we take it to like 1989, 1990, 91, 92, where this sort of very impressive Eurasian superstate that the Russians had built up over 300 years just dissolved. And it's interesting how that happened. It's got something to do with 19th century European nationalism. It's got something to do with silly, not necessarily silly, but policies from the Soviet Union regarding nationalities that ended up fostering an eventual breakup. And yeah, so basically a lot of stuff that Peter the Great put together in the 1600s and early 1700s, and Catherine the Great put together, went flying off in separate Soviet republics. I think that's actually good. I'm pro independence, especially when it's easy, and that was really easy, that independence, because Russia, I think under Gorbachev, made the appropriate decision to just sort of back off and let folks go. It's sort of a miracle that the Cold War ended with peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union rather than an apocalyptic World War III. So yeah, I'm definitely pro the independence of places like the Baltics, the Stans, Ukraine, and even Belarus, which is something that is looking a little more real this year. So these are all good things, but what I want to talk about here and what I want to emphasize is that nobody in Washington, D.C. is paying any attention to the way that these things have changed. Joe Biden, who was already in his 80s when the Cold War ended, feels like that's not true. And certainly a lot of the establishment in Washington D.C., whose paychecks require the world to be much more dangerous, still talk about Russia. I mean, some of them, it's funny. You see the Freudian slips. I think this was some media figure, maybe MSNBC. I can't recall exactly who it was, who started talking about how Trump's given this country to the Soviets. Like, the Soviet Union is not an entity that has existed for 30 years, and even leaving aside the blatantly crazy people who still see the Soviet Union when they see Russia, like whenever somebody comes up to you and talks about the threat that Russia holds over Europe or over Asia or over anybody, just go through some of the basic facts here. Like, look at a map. Like, geography is just so incredibly important here. From the 1700s until 1989, Russia had a very significant position. Like, much of the Baltic coastline, was on the Black Sea in a very, very serious way. Was all the way, certainly from the 1700s, to halfway through Poland, and was bordering throughout from the 1700s. Russia was bordering on Germany, and into the period of the Cold War, Russia was halfway through Germany. Well, not halfway, but it had East Germany very much in its pocket. I mean, it was a tremendously powerful entity. Today, I mean, the Russian borders are, I should have totted up the math, but are they 1,000 miles further east? I mean, Russia is a very big, very powerful nuclear armed stan. It's Russia stan. It is the beginning of the Central Asian step that the U.S. and Europe, if they're acting in concert, as I believe they should be looking to cultivate and rope further in to European, security and economic institutions. Like that's the way that Russia should be looked. Again, just geography. Like people are still talking about Russia like it's the Russia of Peter the Great or Stalin, and it's not. It's just not. The Ukraine thing, which I think was a coup organized by the United States, which is a terrible thing, something we should not have done. But what's interesting is that even though we did this, like, look, what is the result for Russia? It is a dramatically weaker Russia. I mean, Russia, this scary titan that we all have to be intimidated by, has spent 6 years failing to take more than a couple slices of a country that is half Russian, Ukraine, I'm talking about here. So the fact that the borders of Russian power, which you could nominally, not really, because I think a united Ukraine would have been better and would have continued its lean towards Europe and the United States under a unbroken stretch of popularly elected leaders. Instead, we did a coup, but that created a harder line in Europe, which I think is sort of a tragedy. But the fact remains that going down to Crimea and to Donetsk and Luhansk in the east of Ukraine, I mean, that's pretty solidly, U.S. NATO territory now. I mean, sure, the new guy who got elected in Ukraine is, more open to sort of having closer ties to Russia, was more interested in carving off a lot of the Ukrainians who voted for Yakunovich. I was mispronounced that. That's the guy who we couped out in 2013. But I mean, Ukraine is now, sorry, need to stop calling it the Ukraine. That's apparently fascist. Anyway, Ukraine, the country, is more or less de facto aligned with the West. It should not be added to NATO and EU. Okay, that's a whole nother conversation. But like Russia is not the threat it once was. Another way to look at this is in terms of GDP. Okay, so the US GDP is, now all of these are estimates. This is 2018 numbers. This is World Bank, Google numbers, yada, yada. Also, GDP is a fundamentally suspect measure anyway. With this sort of very crude measure, US GDP is $20 trillion in 2018. China's is about 13 trillion. Russia's, going all the way down, is 1.6 trillion. This is less than a tenth of the GDP of the European Union. People seem to think that Russia can just roll through the Baltics if we're not super vigilant about it. And maybe they could physically, briefly, but in any sort of serious conflict of like Russia versus the European Union, anything sort of sustained. I mean, this isn't like the United States versus Japan in 1945. That sort of inevitable crushing defeat of Japan was going to come. Like this is like the United States versus Spain. Like this is not a serious challenge, and certainly Putin is interested in sort of playing his limited cards right. And you can argue, I would argue he hasn't, but you could argue that he's played those cards well. He's successfully carved off, created more frozen conflicts on its periphery and more ill will. But anyway, leaving that aside. But you can argue that he's played a limited card well, but it's just not, like, as I keep saying, it is more a battleground. Russia is more a battleground than a player in geopolitics. It's more so the classic, all those classic questions: are we losing Syria to Russia? Are we losing Libya to Russia? Those are horseshit. Those come up because the United States destroys countries and then sort of isn't really interested in picking up the pieces. And then Russia, with its limited cards to play, can sort of jump in there and look impressive and look important. That's what we did in Ukraine as well. We screwed up Ukraine. We did a coup in Ukraine and put some people in power who didn't have a ton of legitimacy out east. And Russia was able to sort of play its cards right. Like this idea that Russia is going to come out and destabilize places is just not true. It's just not what has actually happened over the past decade. And if like people in Washington D.C. could be bothered to look at a fucking map, they would be able to see that Russia is not the threat that we've always imagined it to be for centuries, if it ever was. So yeah, I think I've made that point. So, and then this more battleground than competitive thing, like I think there's a growing acknowledgement, not in Washington, D.C. or the New York Times or the Washington Post, obviously, but I think among Americans more generally, and in the political parties, both of them actually, both the sort of insurgent wings, the Trumpist wing in Republicans and the more left-leaning wing in the Democrats, both acknowledge that our Middle East policy over the past 10 years has been an extraordinary waste of time. It has been idiotic. We've wasted trillions of dollars winning nothing. Whether you think that the new Cold War against China is somewhat overblown and a poor choice we may be making, it's sort of generally my position, or whether you think the U.S. competition with China is the most important thing. And I do actually agree that U.S. competition with China is what the sort of 21st century is going to be about. I think that is accurately, but of course, what that competition looks like, it doesn't have to be a new Cold War. Regardless, whatever your position is, I think most people who actually think about this stuff, rather than take a paycheck, a think tank paycheck that came from Raytheon, most people who actually think about this know that what we've been doing in the Middle East for the past 2 decades has been an extraordinary waste of time. I would argue that much of what we've been doing in Eastern Europe, certainly in terms of NATO expansion, has also been a terrible waste of time. I mean, let me qualify that. I mean, obviously, U.S. interests need to be protected and defended in Eastern Europe, in the European continent. It is still one of the largest economic units in this world. There are U.S. business interests to protect, U.S. diplomatic interests to protect, U.S. fellow feeling. Europe is where the majority of the people who populated the United States came from, and there's real interests there. However, this idea that Europe is the appropriate venue for geopolitical military competition, led by the DoD and the U.S. Department of Defense, and deranged fucking militarists like Mike Pompeo, who's currently leading the Secretary of State in the United States, which is supposed to be, our diplomatic wing. The idea that I think the resources and the military thought we've been putting into Eastern Europe and Europe is just as wasted and just as foolish as what we've been putting into the Middle East. Obviously, Asia should be our focus here. And as Asia becomes the focus here, like this is the thing. This is where Russia becomes important. Is that Russia is in Europe and Asia. It is, if we're serious about strategic competition with China, there is really no lower hanging fruit for the United States and for Europe more generally than improving relations with Russia. One of the turning points of the Cold War was Nixon going to China. This happened in the early 70s. I believe it was the early 70s. And what happened was, obviously, Russia and China were never as close to each other as we like to pretend. They were both communists, but they were, butting heads, from the 50s. And it just took the U.S. and Europe a while to realize this. But in the 70s, Nixon went to China and basically formally, carved China off, and that sort of set the trajectory of really all of U.S. relations with China since, which was basically turning China into a fellow competitor against the Soviet Union. So what's interesting, there's a certain poetry to it, is that the big thing in the new Cold War, in the strategic competition between China and the United States, will actually be the opposite. It will be the U.S. and Europe carving Russia off to be a greater aid in competition against China. I mean, that just strikes me as, whether that happens I think Trump tried to do it, but he was completely incapable of doing it. I'm not even sure he's capable of thinking on the level of, why that would be a good thing to do. He wanted to be pro-Russia because he likes selling crappy, tasteless real estate to Russians. That's why he was pro-Russia. He tried to do that. I don't know if this eventual, whatever president goes to Russia, really turns things around. I don't know if that'll happen in 5 years or if that'll happen in 20 years, but that's, also going to be a tremendously important part of this sort of, new Cold War thing. So yeah, it's Russia is a playing piece. Like Russia is something to be, um, what's the word? Is something to build an incredible diplomatic victory with for the West. It is not some kind of enemy. I've made videos in the past, and I will, I'm sure, link at the end of this video, a video talking about Russia's interests versus the EU and versus China. And it's not even, I mean, it's a no-brainer. This is what I talk about when I say, like, actually, I don't think Putin's as clever as everybody says he is. Putin has gotten a lot of domestic political benefit out of doing the exact same thing that Washington D.C. does, which is like, remember that old enemy we fought for 50 years? Well, we're going to go fight them again, and you're not, and in return, you're not going to pay any attention to all the shitty stuff that I'm doing at home. Like both Washington D.C. and Putin, are just doing the same thing with each other. It's flip sides. Whereas Russia's long-term strategic interest is not to become a satellite of China. But for domestic political purposes, it's better for Putin. It's an easier distraction from Putin's problems to, to make big strides against the United States and Europe, the people that the Soviet Union propagandized against most enthusiastically for 75 years. So like Putin's really not that smart. If Putin were smart, he'd be finding ways to get closer to sort of rope himself further into the West. Because as we're seeing, I mean, Jesus, like not just Xinjiang. I mean, China, China is taking Hong Kong, that used to be a sort of semi-autonomous thing, and crushing that. Xinjiang, it's interesting. China used to have a nationalities policy that was very similar to Russia because it was worthwhile in appealing to the world to say like, oh, look, we treat our minorities so much better than the Russians do because a lot of these minorities were on the same are shared with Russia, or we treat our minorities better than the Americans do, better than the West does. That was a big part of like communist ideology. So we're not just seeing in Hong Kong, but also with the Hui Muslim minorities, and now it's just coming out the Mongolians, which have no relation to Islam, which used to be another sort of cherished, celebrated PR victory. Look how nice we are to our minorities. They're being crushed as well. Their ability to speak other languages is being crushed as well. And you'd have to be, as China gets richer and more powerful and more tied in to all of these stands around them, you have to wonder, like, what's the sort of sinicization process going to look like in those regions 20 years from now? What's it going to look like in that vast, basically depopulated part of Russia that is above China, is being populated by Chinese people? What's that going to look like? Famously, Yeltsin, I think it was, Yeltsin basically told the Chinese, like, sure, yeah, you are welcome to try to invade our, vacant Russian territories, and then we'll nuke Beijing. That's, a card that Russia has to play. But as time goes on, and as Russia gets more and more absorbed into sort of the Chinese sort of world there, as is absolutely happening with pipelines. There is massive, people keep talking about this sort of $400 billion deal between China and Iran, which is, I think, largely bullshit. But no, there actually is a $400 billion deal between Russia and China, and those pipelines are being built, and those pipelines are where with Russia's putting gas towards Europe, there's this overblown concern that Russia can control Europe through that gas stuff. But what we're sort of learning is that actually Europe kind of controls Russia through that gas network, especially now that Europe has so many alternatives for supply. And China is sort of in the same thing times 5, because with Europe, with the United States, as we'll discuss in just a moment, Russia can play Greece off of Ukraine, off of France, off of Germany, off of Britain, off of Trump, off of all these actors that Russia has political options there. Russia and China, that's one country that Russia has to deal with. There isn't like this, oh, I'm gonna do, play Chongqing what are some other China? I'll play Chongqing off of Tianjin, or I'm gonna play, Guangdong off of Beijing. That's not how it works with China. You don't get to play Paris off of Berlin. You get to deal with China. And that is a unified actor that will get very angry if it does not get its gas, and can also, when angry with Russia, just cut off that gas. So yeah, it is Putin is definitely figuring out local politics by going after the West, but is actually really damaging Russia's long-term interests by getting closer to China. And that's just obvious. Putin is not, in fact, all that smart. So what I do think we've learned recently is that Europeans actually might be more in tune with these realities. And that does specifically get to Nord Stream 2. The Europeans, I think, know that it is in their interest as geopolitical actors to have a Russia that is closer to them, because obviously, Russia doesn't have much population anymore, doesn't have much economic weight anymore. Did I mention that? Just it's extraordinary just how different. If you look at the Soviet Union versus the United States in 1950, Russia had, depending on how you look at, had somewhere between, and just the Soviet Union had somewhere between 50% and double, 50% more and double the population of the United States. Today, the United States population is closing in on triple that of Russia. But yet we're still pretending like Stalin's going on there. Anyway, so yeah, Russia doesn't have as much population it has, doesn't have as much economic weight as it used to have. It does still have a large military that is more willing to go out and die for stuff than the European military, and it also has nukes. So I think Germany specifically, is very interested in getting to a place where they can wrap Russia more tightly to European networks of power, and the United States just keeps fucking it up for them. I guess the Ukraine screw up, wasn't necessarily just the United States. Wasn't like, I think there were Europeans included in that as well, but there weren't German senators going down to them, or maybe there were. Were there German senators, German Reichstag members going down to the protests and in the Maidan and protesting with the Ukrainians like John McCain was? I don't know. But I think certainly now, and I think that's with gas stuff. Nord Stream 2 is something that has come up. And so, yeah, I think Europeans are much more savvy. And I think that's one of the general messages I want to leave you with, is that actually we should take more of a cue from the Europeans when dealing with Russia than we should from our own idiotic fantasies. Because the Europeans are going to know what needs to happen are going to have a better sense of what needs to happen to integrate Russia economically and politically more into Europe and NATO. God, I hate NATO so much, but now it has to exist. Sort of wrapping them more in. The Europeans are going to have a better sense of this than the Americans. So this Nord Stream 2 thing is just such a perfect puncturing of the idea that the Trumpkins have some kind of high-minded and principled approach to building bridges with Russia, which I think building with bridges with Russia is something that absolutely should happen. But no, it's just an indication of how stupid, and then like the layers of stupid here. Okay, so there's Nord Stream. Nord Stream 1 is already in effect, and what Nord Stream does that is good for Russia is it does subsea gas provision to Germany. Actually, maybe only Nord Stream 2 does Germany, but I think to Sweden or Finland or whatever. Nord Stream 1, which has been, I think, there since 2011, provides connections to European countries that avoid Eastern Europe. And that is valuable because it allows Russia to still get gas through to Western Europe, the folks that purchase much more, the richer, more wealthy countries, without having to pay extra taxes and benefits to Eastern European countries that it is falling further and further out of favor with. So the Nord Stream 1 thing apparently isn't being used to capacity, but with Nord Stream 2, the exact technical deals escape me. My understanding is it doubles the volume that can be sent. It also probably provides connections that allow gas to be provided in more ways. I mean, it's incredibly complex stuff. And the Trump administration, these big dastardly friends of Russia, are doing absolutely everything they can to kill the Nord Stream 2 project, which is just idiotic. And it's not, I think it's arguable. I think you'd probably be wrong, and I'm trying to keep this short, but I think it's arguable that maybe Nord Stream is bad for some Eastern European countries, but let Germany decide. Like they let I think that we should be in the United States should step back and let Europe figure it out. Europe has got the EU structures. Europe has got all manner of bilateral relations. Let them figure it out. One of the things that Trump was supposed to be about was letting Europe figure this shit out, right? Well, that's not actually what's happening. That is not what's happening at all. Because with Nord Stream 2, Mike Pompeo, Trump's Secretary of State, is doing absolutely everything he can to stop Nord Stream 2 over the objections of the Germans, and it's not, I think I've talked before on this channel about secondary sanctions, which are a really pernicious thing that the United States does. The United States overuses its basic sanction capability, basically saying no U.S. businesses are allowed to do business with these countries, these people, these that are all over the world. We do way too much of it. We create incredible hardship in countries like Iran and Syria without actually hurting the people in charge at all. Then there's another layer to this, which is secondary sanctions, which is something that the United States never had the balls to do. No, we had the balls to try it a couple times before the end of the Cold War. But it's only really after 9/11 that we've started doing this all the fucking time. And it's a little too complex. So people don't realize how screwed up it is. So with secondary sanctions, we're not just saying US companies can't do business with these countries, these entities. We're saying nobody, no other. So we're essentially what we do there is we exert jurisdiction over the whole world. This is one of the most obvious manifestations of US empire, of American empire, is the United States saying, even if there's no US business related to this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, we're going to sanction any European company or any European bank or any European entity that works on this Nord Stream 2. And that's just tremendously fucked up, because it's basically saying, Germany, the US State Department says to Germany, we don't think you should be doing this Nord Stream 2 thing. And Germany says, well, thank you. We've decided for our own national interests, we would like to do this. And then the US government says, cool, I'm going to bankrupt all your businesses. I mean, it's mafia shit. What's interesting is that Ronald Reagan tried this in the 1980s for the initial, some of the initial gas pipelines that went from the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe. And even then, back when the Soviet Union was like a tremendously important threat and was a real problem, the Europeans were like, fuck you. And it's incredible. And it ended up being a tremendous failure for Reagan. Clinton tried to do secondary sanctions on a couple things in the 90s, and those ended up being big failures for Clinton. And unfortunately, since 9/11, the decision is that we're just able to get away with it. This is beginning to break down with the sort of insane blow up that the Trump administration has imposed after the Iran nuclear deal. So Europeans are getting really pissed off, and they're trying to figure out ways around this secondary sanction stuff. So by, as bad as the Trump's handling of the Iran nuclear deal is, you got to understand there's a lot of sort of brain warped people in Washington, D.C. who think that, and in the U.S. Media infrastructure more generally, which is very deferential to the military industrial complex, that think blowing up Iran the Iran nuclear deal and imposing secondary sanctions on everyone is a good thing. There's really no justification for this. This just basically, other than just sort of insanity, but because our political system is so fucked up on the issue of Russia right now that there isn't much democratic pushback against this thing that Pompeo and the Trump administration is doing, trying to destroy legitimate business between Russia and Germany. That to some extent, I don't know whether it's true or not, Germany, believes is important for its energy security. So it's deeply, deeply offensive and stupid, but no Democrat is going to challenge it because they want to be mean to Russia. So why actually is Pompeo and the Trump administration doing this? And it's unfortunately extraordinarily transparent. They're just trying to drive up, now that the United States is exporting natural gas. I think in 2015, they lifted the 40-year-old ban on U.S. export of petroleum. And I think something like 3 to 4% of European gas now comes from the United States, or maybe that was as of last year. Things have been a little screwed up in the oil and gas markets, as you all know. So yeah, this is just plain old, like, disgusting manipulation of markets in the effort to sell more U.S. gas. This is basically, pissing all over European and German sovereignty in order to sell more gas. It's really just disgusting bullying behavior. It makes me disgusted with things my own country is doing. I mean, it's foul, as is much of the Mike Pompeo Trump administration approach to everything. So yeah, it's quite gross. I have other notes, but yeah, I did mention the Reagan thing. Okay, so let's move on towards Navalny, which is, I think, probably the main objection, I would imagine, that would happen in the chat or comments here. Alexei Navalny on August 20th was poisoned. You can go, because Russia encourages this sort of thing, you can go into endless, maybe there was a faction in Russia that poisoned Navalny to make Putin look bad. I mean, who cares? Because Putin is in charge of that country, and a person who is a well-renowned, well-known opposition politician was poisoned. I think this probably has something to do with Belarus. They really didn't want, the likely leader of a protest movement against Putin to be running around when a protest movement seemed to be succeeding against the dictator in Belarus, right next to Russia. So yeah, it's a really awful, awful thing. And my instinct, frankly, is let Europe handle it. I'm not saying that just because Russia is weaker than we expected, or Russia is a more useful bargaining chip than it is a player that we need to compete against. Just because I'm saying that doesn't mean that they should be allowed to be as brutal and horrific as they want to be. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But I say again that I believe Europe is more appropriately situated to make these kinds of decisions. They have their own negotiating positions. They have their own relationships. They have their own. And my understanding is that it seems like after fighting tooth and nail with the Trump administration over Nord Stream 2 for quite some time, Germany may actually be considering abandoning Nord Stream 2 over the Navalny thing. And if that is what the Germans decide is the right thing to do, is the right way to sort of move forward relations with Russia in the way that they would like, I say, sure, sounds great. And I think that should be their decision. So yeah. So what I would like to see sort of begin to develop in these sort of relations between what I would like to see develop in these relations between the United States and Europe and Russia is sort of like a good cop, bad cop. Like, I think it is shameful, actually, that Trump hasn't come out and said anything about Navalny. I think he absolutely should have made a more forceful statement about Russia's poisoning of an opposition politician. But I think what we can do here is you can have the United States that does sort of the bad cop, does the castigating, does the complaining, does the, maybe even the symbolic sanction type stuff. And then you have Europe that is the good cop that works to sort of wrap Russia in more. Unfortunately, the way that we look at things now, things are so broken that we can't do that. We see Russia as in the United States, we see Russia as this big, nasty, boogeyman. So anybody in Europe who isn't, as outraged and negative about Russia as we are, is somehow betraying us or betraying the West, and we're losing Cyprus to Russia, we're losing Germany to Russia, and it's just stupid. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think with sort of more sensible diplomatic personnel, you can actually have that, where you have Germany sort of works to wrap Russia more tightly in. And again, this is, the concept of losing Germany to Russia is fucking ridiculous. Russia, which is mostly, and Russia is about, I guess it's not quite as small as the Russian economy isn't quite, as small as a third the size of Germany. But when you factor out all that sort of petrostate corruption stuff, Germany does not have, massive petroleum, fossil fuel resources. I think they've even stopped digging for coal. And it has a very serious modern economy that is almost 3 times the size of Russia. Like, if Russia and Germany get closer together, it's Germany eating Russia. It's not the other way around. So yeah, that's something that we should encourage. And then, of course, I'm not just thinking in terms of Germany, also the other 320 million people in the EU and all of their economic. I mean, my God, it's just, Russia has the choice of being absorbed by the European Union or that bloc and China, and being absorbed by the European Union is a better choice. So yeah, we should allow that to happen while the United States does the bad cop stuff, complains, minor sanctions, this, that, and the other thing. So I think the German argument that is roundly poo-pooed is that, look, like as I think is being borne out with the Nord Stream 2 stuff, is like, look, by forming these deeper connections with Russia, it gives us more levers to pull to get to better behavior. And I think that's absolutely been proven to be the case in all of politics for the past 30 years. China has been famously sort of falling apart. Not falling apart. China has famously over the past 4 years gotten progressively nastier and nastier. The coronavirus fuck up, the Xinjiang thing getting truly nasty, the Mongolia thing, the Hong Kong thing. And what nobody is getting through their head is that this has coincided with the Trump administration throwing away soft power influence over China, whether it's US medical scientists that could have seen coronavirus at the beginning, whether it is the journalists, all the US journalists that the United States managed to get kicked out of China, whether it is, it's these soft power elements. Now that Trump has been throwing them away, of course, and China has very straightforwardly gotten nastier. I think that that's not generally the way people look at China, because a lot of Washington, D.C. right now is like, look, Clinton promised us that if we did all this trade stuff, that China would get more liberal and open-facing and da-da-da-da. I would argue that it absolutely has, but it's a country of 1.5 billion people that was, run by Chairman Mao 50 years ago. Like, things are going to take a little longer than it took for fucking Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, countries that are, less than a tenth, significantly, a 20th or 30th the size. But yeah, so I think that people are critiquing Germany's, looking at Germany's, look, hey, like, we're maintaining these soft power elements over Russia so we can better get them to be a better actor on the world stage. I think like that, the reception of that argument is too influenced by the Washington, D.C.'s current disillusionment with China. Like, why isn't China Switzerland yet? And that, of course, applying whether or not you believe that China has made tremendous liberalizing progress, as I do believe it had until the Trump administration started pissing on them and screwing things over. Actually, that started with Clinton, Secretary of State, but that's a different, it's a much longer conversation. So, like, whether or not you believe China has become liberal or not become more liberal, applying the same lessons to Russia, a country with a tenth the size of GDP, a tenth, less than a tenth, so the size of population. It is actually closer to like a South Korea or a Taiwan, or South Korea, Taiwan, or the other ones, Indonesia, countries that did democratize, democratize and improve under the strength of trade and alliance networks. So yeah, I think it makes perfect sense for there to be good cop, bad cop. Just a last thing to throw on to this, just sort of an illustration of how stupid the way that the United States looks at Russia is. So you remember the Russia bounty story? I made an angry video about it 2 months ago. How like the intelligence community was leaking this information that they believed that Putin was paying money for Russian for Afghan Taliban. They were paying bounties for every U.S. soldier that the Afghan Taliban killed. So I saw that it's like, well, A, maybe that's true, but B, why is the intelligence community leaking it? They're leaking it now because it helps to destroy Trump's effort to bring about a peace deal in Afghanistan, and because the defense authorization bill is up, and we need to, create some kind of reason for Congress people to think there's a reason for us to be in Afghanistan. So it came out today, has been reported not as widely as it should be, that the military folks in Afghanistan have now taken a look at this intelligence and they're like, yeah, I don't buy it. They're like, yeah, maybe, but it's not strong enough to act on. So for the past 2 months, we've been, in this very carefully manufactured by U.S. intelligence community and U.S. media thing. We very, this carefully manufactured panic about Russia paying bounties for dead U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, and the U.S. military folks who've now seen all the intelligence say, yeah, I don't buy it. It's not enough for us to act on. It doesn't seem realistic. Now, like if Russia were paying to have U.S. soldiers killed, that would be a bad thing. Obviously, the best way to handle that would be to get U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. But it'd be something worth acting on. Instead, through poorly sourced intelligence community lying, which is 90% of everything we hear about the war on terror, we've been in a 2-month tizzy that the U.S. military doesn't believe adds up. I think some people are exaggerating this, saying that like, oh yeah, like the U.S. U.S. military says it's all bullshit, and it's they don't say it's all bullshit, but they say like, yeah, this just doesn't raise to the level of something that's actionable. I haven't seen any real proof. This is some Taliban knew he could, guy who says this happened, but Taliban obviously wants to create friction between the United States and Russia, or the United States and anybody who will keep the United States from bombing Taliban. So yeah, that was just a really fascinating example of just how badly the United States screws up its dealings with Russia. I mean, and God, don't start me on this election interference stuff. Yeah, like they hacked somebody with bad email security. Allegedly, that's not even been particularly proved, other than the intelligence people who just spent the past 2 months trying to fucking get us going crazy about these Afghanistan bounties that probably don't exist. And then they did some internet trolling. Yeah, like you hear again and again, 112 Americans saw Russian ads during the 2016 election, and then it's like, yeah, but what's that 112 million out of? Oh, you mean out of like 2 trillion daily impressions on Facebook or something along those lines? It's basically like $100,000 ad campaign putting together not particularly good disinformation. Fox News and CNN, frankly, do a lot more election swinging disinformation than like by orders of magnitude than this Russia thing that supposedly gave it to Trump. So anyway, so yeah, like all of this that I've discussed today is reliant on a premise that may not actually be valid. Like if you think the new Cold War is at all serious, if you think there is anybody in Washington, D.C. or in a political party who's at all serious about the coming decades of competition with China, whether it be in the new Cold War framework or just in a sort of political diplomatic framework. And I do believe that political diplomatic competition with China over the coming century is inevitable. That's the show. That's a big deal. I don't think anybody in Washington, D.C. really believes that. Because if anybody in Washington, D.C. was serious about competition with China on any level, whether it be old-fashioned, buying more nukes, Cold War stuff, or just on a more sensible economic diplomatic front, then the most important thing for them to do would be to get Russia more on side, on the sort of Western U.S. European side. That would be the most important thing to do. But I guess we're learning just how serious Washington, D.C. is not about competition with China. All right. Well, that took an hour. Shouldn't have taken an hour. I apologize. I'm now going to dive into the chat on my phone for some reason. Okay. Okay. Questions. Do we have questions? We have questions. Well, actually, do we have any super chats that I missed? I think is a good. Did I miss any super chats? Loga, are you going to let me know in the chats? Okay, here's a question. Cletus223 is a great question. What do you think will happen in China as the proportion of young males becomes larger to young females grows? Civil disorder, attempts to raise birth rates, etc. This is a really classic sort of right-wing approach. It's like, well, and it's true. I mean, there's absolutely an imbalance between males and females in China. There's a real problem with elective abortions, especially when there was only one child. A patriarchal, traditional sexist society, the Chinese society, wanted that one child to be a man rather than a woman. And what has happened, of course, is that this has driven up the value of the women who are left in China. It's not like all women were killed. It was something like a typical sort of 56% female, 54%, 51% female, 49% male thing is now like 55% male. And that's a lot, of course, when you're dealing with a country of 1.4 billion. But I think, so the classic answer to Cletus's question is, well, then, they're definitely going to be extremely aggressive militarily and blah, 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 blah. And I think that's kind of horseshit. There's the fact that China is becoming, more wealthy than a lot of countries in the region. And as racist as they are, I think that some of those, folks who aren't some of those guys who don't fit on the Chinese marriage market will reach out to poorer folk in China or other countries in the region. I don't think it's as much of a problem, and this idea that it's going to make China more warlike is just ridiculous. Because there's okay, think about it. You're a powerful person who makes decisions for China. Are you gonna you can't get laid or find the bride you want, so you're gonna invade someplace? No, you're going to find the bride you want at a lower level of status, and that goes all the way down. The folks who are actually really bearing the brunt of this are, impoverished farmer dudes out in the sticks in China, and it's not like they're making decisions. Also, the other aspect of this sort of one-child policy thing is that, so China's going to be willing to, they call them the little emperors, the one child in a lot of these families. So you've got the entire demographic structure of China that's completely reliant on one son or daughter. You think they're going to be willing to throw away those children in some kind of apocalyptic war against Russia or Taiwan? No, God, no. Back when World War I and World War II were happening, China, the United was very much a participant in World War II. Japan, the United States, all these European countries, every family had well, not every family, but most families had 3 or 4 kids, minimum. And many families had 10, 12. It's a lot more to go. It's a lot easier to go through a horrific apocalyptic war when your whole demographic structure isn't reliant on like one person. So yeah, like this, I think that the our idea that China's unmarried male masses are gonna naturally go to war is just not true. I mean, yeah, doesn't make much sense. Okay. Local Cool Extreme asks, More Freedom Foundation, why is California messing up the wildfires? There's a really interesting comment today where Trump made the, I think, accurate comment that, like, well, there needs to be better forest management in California. That's why we really have these fires. And Gavin Newsom was like, yeah, but the federal government owns like 57% of the burning land in California. So it's like, actually, that was Trump's fault. So yeah, I think there was a big ProPublica article that I started reading. And the thing is, like, yes, and this is a constant problem with a lot of the climate change stories, is that yes, like climate change is absolutely impacting the wildfires. Climate change is absolutely impacting the hurricanes. It is a tremendous issue. It is a growing issue. It is a real problem. But like, what kind of like to what extent is this problem? What's the word that I'm looking for? Like the responsibility of climate change. Is it like 3% climate change fault? Is it 50% climate change fault? And I think that there's, people get opened up for good counter arguments if you're just like, climate change does all this stuff. And it's, climate change makes all this stuff worse. That is absolutely true. But I think that there's a lot of media that's just constantly trumpeting like, oh, look, it's climate change did this, where someone like points out, which is accurate. Well, actually, it's also because the federal and California groups in like federal and California grouping, federal and California governmental entities are not doing the amount of controlled burns that they absolutely should do. They're doing fewer controlled burns than they were 20, 30 years ago. This is for potential litigation issues. This is for, local political issues. This is just for, whatever. But of course, the way that Trump sees this is like, it's not climate change. It's actually land management. And as with so many things, it's both, and it's a dozen other things. And I think that's a real problem with the way that a lot of issues are discussed, is this idea that there's one reason why everything's happening. I mean, obviously, crime would be the most obvious and ridiculous example of this, where it's just like, oh yeah, like, criminals, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like, crime went down because cops. Oh no, crime went down because abortions. Oh no, crime went down because of lead. Oh no, crime went down because of video games. A million different things. Like, obviously, the answer is all of these reasons. And I think, though, when we sort of say, oh, it's definitely just climate change is the reason we have hurricanes and wildfires, you set yourself up for some dumb arguments. But absolutely, I think it is climate change. And I think Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is in particular pushing this idea that, oh, it's just climate change, when it's also incredible mismanagement by California, incredible mismanagement by Trump. It's a lot of things, but obviously it's climate change too. All right. Brando Commando says, the German government has people with a super chat. Thank you, Brando Commando. I'm very, very grateful. The German government has people that want to keep it in the Western sphere, as well as people that want to improve relations with Russia, just like there are people in Russia that want Turkey to move away from the United States. Yes, I mean, I think that's a very good point that Brandon Commando makes. There is a there are a range of approaches in every country's government. Like, I think there's even Putin has people who are like, look, man, like, we're getting too close to China. Like, there's a wide range. The one thing that I would object to, Brando Commando, and the way you're putting this is that, like, and I think I mentioned it, is like the German government has people who want to keep Germany in the West, unless I'm misunderstanding, Germany in the Western sphere, as well as people that want to improve relations with Russia. And I don't think, I think if Germany improves relations with Russia, I think then Russia is automatically getting wrapped further into the Western sphere because I mean Germany is in NATO, Germany is in the EU, which is really encouraged by the United States and very useful to it. When Germany improves relationships with Russia, they're just improving the strength of the US oriented Western sphere. That's the way I see it. And I think that's just logical. If you just look at the way geography looks right now, if you look at the way that, um, the relative size of the Russian and German economies look right now, if you look at just the simple fact that China at some point could say to Russia, we don't like what you just did, so we're not going to buy gas from you. With the more volume that Germany is adding, they can say, "Oh no, we'll take that, cheaply. We'll take all that surplus gas." So yeah, I agree that yeah, there's dispute within the German government, but no matter how, at least as in the setup of things that I see now, I don't see how Germany actually hurts relationships with the United States by getting closer to Russia, other than people in the United States being fucking idiots. I think is the way I want to say that. Thank you so much for that super chat. Yeah, I did not talk much about the sort of Turkey aspect here. I have videos talking about how silly the idea of a long-term relationship between Turkey and Russia are. They're both, I mean, look at them. They are both run by super nationalist guys who are about restoring the greatness of Turkey and Russia. And if you know anything about the history of the Russian and Ottoman empires, like they fought each other for hundreds of years. Turkey controls the Bosphorus, which is Russia's main outlet onto the Mediterranean and sort of the broader sea. Actually, that's less important now that the ice caps are melting. But it's still very important. Like there are so many natural places where Russia and Turkey will fall into conflict. Yeah, and I'm happier with Germany managing this stuff. I think what actually is interesting is that I talked last Tuesday about the clown show with Greece and Turkey, and I think Germany is kind of, managing that for the United States. The threat of the U.S. Navy is always back there to, make sure that, Turkey doesn't invade a bunch of Greek islands or anything. And Germany just sort of handles it. And I think that's a better use of U.S. resources, is letting Germany handle more stuff. All right. Questions. Any questions? Okay. Drakery asks, how big of a role does lobbying bribes from folks like Browder and Poroshenko play in America's and establishment's unwillingness to rue Russia into the Western Bloc? Is it just conspiracy? No, it's not just a conspiracy. Or rather, it's not a conscious conspiracy. I talk about this a lot. I've got a whole series on the military-industrial complex. And actually, my first and probably could have been the only video on the Russia hoax back in 2016 was saying, like, look, you got to understand here, it's not evil people like Browder or Poroshenko. It's not some like sinister pay-for-play plot that makes the United States angry at Russia. It is 70 years of propaganda, 80 years. No, I mean, going back to 1917, it is a century of U.S. propaganda. These communists, and yeah, they're not communists anymore, but fear of Russia is just naturally in the air. And much more importantly, a lot of people's jobs depend on it. I'm not talking about, Poroshenko's the Ukrainian oligarch. I'm not talking about, stuff like that. I mean, in Washington, D.C., think tanks, academics, media, the Pentagon, defense contractors depend on, do you know how many jobs depend on the U.S. NATO presence in Europe? A lot. Do you know how many jobs depend on the ability to sell, weapons that really only work in the European context? A lot. So it's not as with a lot, as with a lot of people who are like, oh, the Israel lobby or some bribes from da da da. Da. It's not. I mean, in some instances, yeah, like looking at a certain issue, you're like, sure, a Poroshenko or a Browder can facilitate like a bit of negativity, sure, but like it's what's much more important is the broader reliance of much of the U.S. government on instability, on enemies. And we've worked very hard for the past 30 years to build up China to the point where they can be the one big enemy again. We'll take any enemy it foreign policy, military industrial complex apparatus of any enemy because they're just desperate to keep the party going, to keep the gravy train going. So it is corruption for sure, but I don't know that it's even conscious corruption. There's a lot of people who've just convinced themselves that the world is corruption. There's a lot of people who've just convinced themselves that the world is dangerous. It is what it is. So no, it's not some nasty conspiracy. It's just the way the world works, and we'd like to stop it working that way. And that's why you should donate to this channel, keep it going. Where I, try to draw people's attention to the truth. Anyway, okay. Next, we have a super chat from Matt. Thank you. Do you see Poland as a key player in the future of Central Europe? I believe the three. That's a great question, Fado, but I have Matt's to get to first. Do you see Poland as a key player in the future of Central Europe? I believe the Three Seas initiative will be good for the Balkans, even Greece. I am embarrassed to admit I don't know exactly what the Three Seas initiative is. Is that what the Baltic, the Aegean, and the Mediterranean? Um, Black Sea, Baltic, Black Sea. So is that Poland or is that Eastern Europe? Yeah. Well, it's embarrassing when I don't know what something is. I do not know what the Three Seas initiative is. To speak to the broader, but yes, I do see Poland as a growing player in Central Europe. I've got one video on Poland where I sort of complain about the fact that they get so much more money than Tunisia, and they do get a lot of free money, but they deserve it because Poland had a really horrific history, from the being gobbled up by Austria, Prussia, and Russia to the brief moment of freedom between World War One and World War Two. It was crushed in like the nastiest way possible by Stalin and Hitler, and just like half a century under communism. It is, yeah. I like to point out that how much free money Poland and the other Eastern European countries get, but God, it's the least. It's the least Europe can do after such a centuries of unceasing horror. And what's also impressive is just how much that has been done with it. Poland, yeah, I think depending on who you ask, it's a fully developed country. It is getting I think it's getting competitive with Spain in terms of sort of GDP per capita, maybe not quite, but it's arrived, and that is a fantastic thing. And yes, it is. It's got a population about the size of Ukraine, but an economy. I haven't looked at that. What, 10 times bigger? 5 times bigger? And it's a country of 40 million. It is a serious country in the center of Europe, and it can play its cards right to become influential and positive in a number of ways. So I'm very positive on Poland. Absolutely see it as a key player to an extent where it really hasn't been, honestly, since the 1600s, which is kind of crazy. Poland, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 1500s was the largest country in Europe, tremendously powerful. And then Russia and Sweden sort of carved it up. And then it was fine in through the 1600s, and then in the 1700s, at the end of the 1700s, Poland essentially disappeared off the map. So it is fantastic to see Poland as coherent, powerful entity. And yes, it's a real thing, and I think it's part of like the sort of real step forward that we've really seen through this sort of 70 years of stability. This sort of 80 years of stability. Well, yeah, no, 75 years of stability since the end of World War II. the idea that smaller entities like this, just 40 million people in the middle of Europe, can actually exert themselves in serious ways, economically, diplomatically, whereas they're not just sort of batted about between more major powers. It's great that Poland's finally gotten the chance to achieve real independence. Interestingly, through um, through the construct of the EU. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. I'm not sure if I recently just read another fucking George Friedman book, and one of his big things in the century to come was like Poland and Turkey are going to be the colossi bestriding the continent with their new powers, and I just never quite understood that, honestly, with Poland or Turkey. I do think Turkey is a growing serious power to be taken seriously. Poland, yeah, I think people are a little overdoing the extent of its power because it's right next to Germany, which is much bigger and also much wealthier. And then there's also Russia. So yeah, it's I don't know, but yeah, Poland is a country I'm excited to see do well. Let's see. Have 4chan become mainstream? Okay, Fadel asks, with a super chat, thank you so much, has asked, have 4chan become mainstream conservatism? QAnon. That is a fascinating question. So, 4chan, which, it's funny, I was reading a novel from like 2013, and it's funny, 4chan used to have a more ambivalent reputation. I was just maybe I was wrong. I was reading this Cory Doctorow book. It seemed to say that actually the whole anonymous thing. Do you remember like the hackers with the Guy Fawkes masks? Those apparently came from 4chan too. And I remember thinking some of those anonymous guys were okay and doing interesting stuff. So that's kind of fascinating the way that 4chan is involved. But what 4chan is mostly known for, there's 4chan and then there's 8chan or something. These are basically completely anonymous news groups where people, post all kinds of racisms and nastiness, and that's sort of where the alt-right was supposed to have come from. And yes, it is also, I believe, a source of the QAnon conspiracy, which is something that we all laughed at for a couple of years, but as we're coming up into the election, we're realizing, holy shit, this is a lot more terrifying and influential than we thought. Now, this is both in the breadth. So the QAnon conspiracy is basically some guy, I think all the way back in 2017, started posting on 4chan claiming to be an insider in the Trump administration. And what he had to say was that actually, all of the Democrats and all of the Hollywood people, all of the people that right-wing people hate are involved in a dastardly pedophile conspiracy where they're drinking the blood of children. It gets all the way back to like anti-Semitic fantasies, from long before. All of these, they're all, doing this. And I know as Q, this person who's working for the Trump administration, that a special day is going to come, the storm, where we arrest all of these pedophiles and everybody's going to go to jail. And Trump and Mueller, yeah, right. Trump and Mueller and John F. Kennedy Jr. are going to team up and they're going to bring America back to the way it was. And Hillary Clinton's going to go to jail and everybody you don't like is going to go to jail and America's going to be renewed. I mean, it was insane. And it was all going to happen on December 15th, 2017. So it's like a classic millenarian cult. The end is nigh, the end is coming, which is a very established part of U.S. culture. And this was, this was laughed at great length. Oh dear, am I losing? Okay, I gotta speed it up, guys. Got super chats to go through. Was laughed at great length. The problem is the people who do believe in this QAnon thing, and it's a well-established thing that once the date of the apocalypse comes and goes, people are willing to look for the next date and keep going for it. So the presence of this Q conspiracy and the people who believe in it fervently is terrifying. Like I'm up here in Michigan, I've seen bumper stickers, I've seen big posters with the "Where we go one, we go all" slogan and whatnot. That's not as important as the way that it filters out into the broader electorate. So there are a lot of people who just sort of hear stuff and then vote based on that. So I don't think like the actual QAnon conspiracy believers are enough to tilt the election. However, there are a lot of people out here, out in this country, who are desperately looking for reasons to support Trump. You know, they supported him the first time around. Things haven't gone very well, and you know, it's a real problem. So they're sort of looking for reasons to justify it. And these QAnon folks, just by virtue of being, you know, 100,000 people or whatnot, can make certain topics trend. So if, you know, the Daily Caller, and I think very much like more supposedly upstanding right-wing news outlets are playing with this, Ted Cruz as well, you'll see how everyone's really obsessed with a Netflix documentary that's supposedly kind of pedophile-ish, or show that's kind of pedophile-ish. Ted Cruz has been pushing that. And the reason he's pushing that is because it sends this like, ooh, Democrats are pedophiles message that is underpinned by a bunch of truly insane people who want there to be like a big nasty coup in the United States. These are the QAnon people. And the thing is, of course, you know, Bill Clinton went to Pedophile Island with Jeffrey Epstein, and that's something you can Google at length. I mean, that's a real thing. Um, Obviously, that doesn't mean that there are underground tunnels full of blood-sucking Democrats boning children in every town in America, as you know, QAnon might tell you. But yeah, like, and nobody's really condemned Bill Clinton. So I think it's a real vulnerability in this upcoming election. You've got, you know, these millions of people who supported Trump and can see it's been a disaster, but are looking desperately for any reason to support. And then you've got Ted Cruz, and then you've got the Daily Caller, and then you've got the 100,000 QAnon or whatever QAnon aficionados who are willing to push all this bullshit on Facebook. And you've got this like, oh, I saw this with some guy I knew from high school on Instagram. Was started posting about, oh, you know, the biggest child sex trafficking scandal in U.S. history is being unveiled right now. Why isn't the media talking about it? I'm like, dude, what the fuck is this? He's like, well, I don't know. I just saw it. And, you know, I had like a little mini intervention with him, but like that kind of shit is, you know, and I like, you know, went to a, you know, I grew up in a fairly affluent suburb, went to a pretty nice high school. Like, if I'm already seeing that, like, not QAnon itself, but like QAnon adjacent thinking going on in my high school class, then holy fuck. Like, I am not still do believe that Joe Biden will win comfortably, but it is pretty horrifying that QAnon and people who believe in this sort of malicious, very close to protocols of Elders of Zion horseshit, will be swinging the election in November. And yes, that is terrible. But yeah, has 4chan become mainstream conservatism? Like, that's kind of, which is, because yeah, Ted Cruz is up there talking about pedophiles. And of course, Ted Cruz isn't going to be like, the storm is coming, Hillary Clinton and, you know, and you know, Bill de Blasio are gonna you know, be dropped out of a helicopter because of pedophilia. No, he's not going to do that, but he will say, oh, look at these Democrats, look at Obama supporting pedophilia because of this Netflix documentary, you know, or you know, some French film on Netflix. I haven't looked into it. Like, that's absolutely, Ted Cruz knows what he's playing with there, and it's deeply fucked up. So yes, yeah, 4chan is becoming mainstream conservatism. Sorry, I'm behind on the super chats. Abdigani Sugal asks, should Turkey give its blessing to Kurdistan? No. Okay, that was easy. No, so okay, so should Turkey give its blessing to Kurdistan? What does that mean? Like, Turkey is actually already has very good relations with Iraqi Kurdistan, which is something that's an underappreciated fact of geopolitics. I think actually Erdogan, prior to losing that election in 2015, was much better with Kurds in Turkey than any of his predecessors. And then he, after 2015, he turned to becoming much worse. So do you mean, should the HDP, the Kurdish Turkish party, should they be allowed to run provinces in Turkey that they win election to? Yes, absolutely. I definitely think that should happen. And the fact that Erdogan has been arresting all those people and putting all those mayors in jail is fucked up. Uh, but like, what should Turkey like say? You know what? Fuck it. Here's half our country. Make it Kurdistan. No, like obviously not. No, it's not in anybody in Turkey's interest. Arguably, I almost certainly not even in the interests of Turkish Kurds for there to be like a new Kurdistan established. I think Iraqi Kurdistan should be established, is established with a degree of autonomy. I think that any sensible resolution of Syria involves Rojava or the Syrian Kurds making some kind of accommodation with Assad, because honestly, like Assad desperately needs a good, powerful, coherent set of fighters. He doesn't really have that. I mean, he's got elements of that in the Syrian army, but he's not going to use the Syrian army to then go in and crush Rojava. If he can get, I think the Syrian Kurds should get some degree of autonomy. I think that the HDP in Turkey should be allowed to run those provinces, not obviously declare independence or anything, but like, yeah, I believe that these are important things. Oh shit, I'm so behind. These are important things that should happen. And then maybe over the course of decades, as Turkey joins the EU, and then Syria joins the EU, and then Iraq joins the EU, anyway, or maybe some kind of regional. As heartbreakingly, Turkey was already trying to set up right before the U.S. destroyed Syria. U.S. and Turkey destroyed Syria in 2011. There's some kind of regional free trade area between Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon. Then these things begin to matter less, and people in Turkey, in that part of Turkey, can be proud of their Turkish ancestry and their Kurdish culture or whatever. But no, I don't think like Turkey should be like, okay, cool, take half our country. Yeah, so that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Okay, Fog Niebuhr. Wait, did I miss any? Nope. Okay. There's Files, Super Chat. There is Digani's Super Chat. Fog Niebuhr asks, Anonymous started as a troll movement to mock Scientologists. That is interesting, Fog Niebuhr. I did not know that. Thank you so much for the Super Chat. Yeah, Anonymous, it's funny. Remember Anonymous? I mean, that was like a tremendously big deal, I guess, back, I can't even remember. And it became like maybe I'm crossing a number of different things, but the Guy Fawkes mask, the mask with the mustache, became this sort of omnipresent. I remember Gezi Park back then. It was a huge part of my life was the Gezi Park protests in Turkey. And yeah, a lot of people were wearing those Guy Fawkes masks, like V for Vendetta. Yeah, it was a tremendously powerful element in the culture. And I think there were probably elements where it went too far or did things that people didn't really appreciate. But now it seems to be kind of gone. Fognieber, majority of the Q lore is super pro-Israel, says Fognieber. Yeah, it's interesting how the Q lore can be super pro-Israel, because so is Trump on some readings, but if that shit, but it's also very anti-George Soros, which is like, getting quite anti-Semitic. And if you're talking about, complaining about George Soros's donations to democratic causes, like, okay, that's legit. But if you're like doing it in the same thing where you're talking about how Democrats are drinking the blood of small children and doing pedophilia, like that's straightforwardly anti-Semitic. So yeah, anti-Semitic and pro-Israel is unfortunately a big dynamic in the United States right now. But yeah, it ain't good. It ain't good. Abdigani Sugal says, will the second Arab Spring be successful? Yeah, I did a video like 6 years ago called Why I Love the Arab Spring. And I think the first Arab Spring was successful. God damn it. And I think that this continuation will eventually be successful. I mean, Tunisia is an established democracy. Like my classic, like, how long do you think it took for France to establish a functioning, healthy republic after 1789, after the beginning of the French Revolution? How long do you think it took? 80 years. It took 80 years for France to establish the Third Republic, one that actually worked for a number of decades strung together without falling into some kind of empire or other disaster. So, yeah, I think this first Arab Spring was successful. It was successfully crushed by counter-revolutionaries in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, just as the 1848 uprising in Europe was successfully crushed by successfully crushed by European counter-revolutionary monarchs. But the effects of 1848, eventually did, one of the most important countries in 1848 was Hungary, and by 1867, Hungary had achieved a degree of autonomy and independence. So I think that the Arab Spring, the story of the first Arab Spring, the only Arab Spring, hasn't even really begun to be told. I suppose when you're talking about the second Arab Spring, you're talking about Sudan and Algeria, things that who both kicked out nasty dictators in 2019. Of course, neither Algeria nor Sudan has fully consolidated like a real democracy yet. These things take time. These things can take decades. It's why it's so extraordinary that Tunisia has now functioned as a functioning democracy for a decade now. And that's, it may seem like not much, but trust me, it's something. And I think things are building. So yeah, I think the second Arab Spring will be successful, even if, the Sudanese military manages, I think is a distinct possibility, manages to crush the democratic elements, even if the Algerian, pouvoir manages to crush the Hirak. Like, even if these things have been successful and will continue to be successful, if that makes sense. Abhigidani Sugal says, I meant general good relations. This is talking about the Kurdistan question. I didn't know they had good relations with Iraqi Kurdistan. Yes, Turkey has pretty solid relationship with Iraqi Kurdistan, which is fascinating. They actually, when Kobane was about to fall to ISIS, they famously wouldn't let the PKK come in to support the Kurds there, but they would let the Iraqi Kurds come in to support Kobane, which is kind of interesting. I'm not sure if that actually happened or if that was something they were willing to do, but it's something that I've always remembered. Yeah, the Turks have very good relationship with Iraqi Kurdistan because since 1991 or so, Iraqi Kurdistan has had some degree of independence and access to oil and gas resources, and Turkey is very external oil and gas export dependent. But yeah, for whatever reason, they still have strong relations. That does not mean that Turkey would be okay with Iraqi Kurdistan declaring independence from Iraq, which Iraqi Kurdistan tried and failed to do. I guess, was it 2 years ago, 6 months ago? I don't know. They would not be okay with that, I'm sure. Okay, we've got, Abidjan Sugo, check. Brando Commando, thank you for another super chat. Tremendously generous fella. Macron is taking a hard stance against Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. French military is far superior to any in the region, but a cornered Erdogan is a dangerous Erdogan. Why has he stepped up and Merkel silent? I think because actually what France and Germany are really doing in the Eastern Mediterranean right now is good cop, bad cop, which is good cop, bad cop? Is that a universally understood concept? It's the idea that when the police are interrogating a suspect, and one person will come in and be like, "Oh, fuck you," or in the TV shows they'll punch him, even though that should get that cop sued within an inch of his life. But the bad cop comes in and roughs up the person, the suspect roughs him up and tells them they're going to lose their whole lives or they're going to go after their family or whatever. And then the good cop comes in and says, "Hey, we're your friend. We're pals. What can we do to make things easier for you?" And I think that Germany and France are kind of good cop, bad copping. And I have no idea what France is doing military escalation in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think it's pretty irresponsible, but actually maybe I think it's entirely possible that Merkel and Macron are communicating, and Merkel says I'm going to keep a lid on things, because Merkel's role throughout the Eastern Mediterranean thing has been to be very conciliatory, been trying to get both Greece and Turkey to back down or whatever. So now I guess It's quite possible that Merkel's like, look, I'm going to keep being the conciliatory one. Macron, why don't you go be bad cop? My explanation in this video last Tuesday was to say, well, actually, I think it's, I think it's just embarrassing, you know, embarrassing love of empire on the part of the French, on the part of Macron and other French folks. Good golly gosh, I gotta speed up here. So many super chats. I'm very grateful. Thank you, folks. But actually, a lot of people, some French folks in the comments push back, and they're like, actually, we don't give a shit about the Eastern Mediterranean. So maybe Macron is just trying to shore up his popularity in the French military. That's a possibility. Folks don't quite realize that France is only really a half century away from military coups. But I think it's entirely possible, maybe as an alternative explanation, that Merkel and Macron are doing a good cop, bad cop routine on Erdogan to make sure that things stay in line. Yeah, so maybe I was unfair to the EU. Maybe they are actually doing a better job of handling this problem without having to draw the United States into it. That's a possibility. I could have been wrong. Fog Niebuhr says, Anonymous was never a singular movement. They all have different political beliefs and goals. Some either supported or opposed Trump in 2016. That's a very good point. I think that's a very interesting aspect of like a leaderless movement. I mean, as Anonymous very quite consciously was, just sort of small groups or cells deciding what was or was not useful. I mean, it's a fascinating, Trump has been a fascinating scrambling of things. I mean, who knows? Maybe if I were a little more honestly anti-establishment, maybe I would have been a Trump supporter, I guess, but not really, because Trump has been completely co-opted by the establishment. One of the famous, I used to be much more explicitly libertarian, but I said that Donald Trump turned me into a globalist. I think Trump's election sort of showed me how much I valued, maybe it also has something to do with turning 40, just how much I valued a lot of things about the status quo, about, what, the sort of the world looked like that Trump was threatening to burn down. So I don't know, like, I could see actually why, I think it's like, oh gosh, Anonymous went wrong and started supporting Trump, but I could see how people could convince themselves, and in some aspects maybe even be right about Trump being the better anti-establishment person to support. But I do have to say that people who thought that Trump was, more peaceful, I mean, I think it just came out in the Woodward stuff that Trump wanted to assassinate Assad, which would have been it would have really turned Syria into a Libya. Which is not great. Okay. Altair Auditor says, just here to support. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you, Altair Auditor. I'm very, very grateful for that. Fadel says, oh God, would Don Jr. be the first 4chan poll president? I think Donald Trump Jr. is lately, man, I feel like it's interesting how so many folks who are not from the United States, as I do not believe Fadel is, like, are just follow U.S. politics as well or better than I do. But I have noticed that Don Jr., Donald Trump's son, has lately been sort of trumpeted as a good alternative or a positive, not a good alternative, positive at all, but like as a likely successor to Donald Trump. And honestly, I just don't buy it. Things that are in his favor is that he's unlike his father. He's like supposedly more of a redneck. He likes to go hunting. He delivers all the red meat Fox News talking points better than his mentally declining father does. He's hooking up with the Fox News. One of the Fox News hotties, like, this is supposedly there's some way that this is supposed to appeal. Honestly, I don't buy it. I just don't see it. I think that's all a little more than a little overblown. I think that Donald Trump Jr. is a bit of a clown. And he just doesn't, like, a lot of Donald Trump's power and ability to be there has to do with decades of being a known quantity in pop culture, and especially the last decade, where The Apprentice, the NBC television show that ran for a decade, took Donald Trump from a like largely mocked sort of artifact of the 1980s and turned him into this sort of like business demigod or whatever. And like, Donald Trump Jr. is never going to have that. If you actually watch Donald Trump Jr. speak in person, yeah, he's good at delivering some of the dumbest red meat to the Fox News audiences. I watched a little bit of his national convention speech, and I think the standard joke on Twitter was that he just seemed coked up. Like, I don't think Don Jr. is as ready for prime time as a lot of people seem to want to make him look like. So yeah, I don't think that Don Jr. has much of a political future, no matter how much he may think he does. I want to point out, so this is we're about the point where the stream crapped out last time. We're at about an hour and 40 minutes. So if it does crap out, I just want to say thank you all for being here. Yeah, I will not, try to recover it. Delivered my presentation, done a lot of Q&A. I think that I've done the live chat. So if it does cut out, then that will be, I'll just say thank you for being here. But until it does cut out, we are in bonus rounds. I'm eager to answer more questions and will continue to do so for at least another 20 minutes and maybe longer if there are enough super chats. Okay, questions. I think I did all of the super chats. I am all caught up on the super chats. LNG Mania says, dude, seriously, Russia is not even a regional power? Okay, I thought you're prejudiced by being pro-Turkey, but this is another level. Seriously, consider changing career, man. Sheesh. I didn't say Russia wasn't a regional power. I said Russia absolutely is a regional power. I said Russia is not a superpower. Russia is not a great power. I said Russia is more of a battleground than a serious player. I would still say that Russia is a more serious power than Turkey, though I think we may be in a position where we're seeing crossing streams. Hopefully, Turkey will never be a massive nuclear power the way that Russia is, but I do think there's a lot of dynamism and vigor and just sort of compactness to Turkey that allows itself that I see more power potential there than I do with Russia. The problem with Russia is that it's not a lot of people. I mean, it's a lot of people by the standards of a European country, but it's not a lot of people considering the sort of extent of land that it controls. But yes, yeah, LNG Mania, you don't seem to be on board with the idea that Russia is not the Soviet Union and is not a superpower. I don't know what to tell you other than you can watch this again. Anyway. Okay. Oh, there was another super chat, which is from Gerhan A. It is an emoji. I'm grateful for the emoji. It is a flying emoji. I don't know what I can say on that. Okay, Local Cool Extreme says, Mo Freedom Foundation. So Trump endorsed extrajudicial killings by police. Will this embolden the growing militia movement, and will we see a resurgence of the militia like in the 1990s? I think that, yeah, for those of you who don't know, there was a Trump supporter who murdered 2 people in, I believe, Kenosha, Wisconsin. Because of our current gun laws, I'm pretty sure he will not be convicted of anything. I think there's a distinct chance that he will get off. He went to a protest in another town with a gun, started an altercation, was, attacked by somebody and killed 2 people. But yeah, according to our current laws, I'm pretty sure that's okay, which is deeply fucked up. And Donald Trump decided to make him a hero. A couple days later, a bunch of Trump supporters did a parade through Portland, Oregon, a city that is not a big fan of the Trumpers in the suburbs. And somebody who I think showed up armed got himself shot. And that's a bad thing, too. And somebody murdered him, I think is also the same. I think, people should not be dying at protests, even if they're Trump supporters. But what is deeply fucked up is that the next day or so, the whatever police department announced that they had killed somebody in the process of attempting to interview a suspect in this murder. And there are eyewitness accounts that said that, oh, these cops didn't, try to, arrest this person. They came in like a death squad and just killed him. And that's terrifying. and something that we should find out much more about. And then Donald Trump asked about it in an interview, did what Donald Trump did, and says, "Oh, it's good that there's retribution." So I don't know that he's really endorsing extrajudicial killings. I think he's just an idiot who, is incapable of saying anything appropriate or positive. But yes, that is terrifying. It's interesting. So we have Loga asks if we're going to see a resurgence of the militia movement of the '90s. And we have seen a resurgence of the militia movement, though the militia movement back then actually had leaders, which is sort of a distinction. Who's it who keeps pointing out? It's a house guest here keeps pointed out one of the Bundy guys. This is the family that I always get this wrong. There's like brothers and fathers but regardless, it was a family with a land dispute with the federal government in Oregon that occupied a nature center or something in a standoff that went much, much longer than it would have been if, they had not been white people. And eventually one of the people was killed. So the leader of that was some Bundy guy. And it was interesting is like he's come out as being like super pro Black Lives Matter and anti-cop, which is very disappointing to a lot of people. There's like the Oath Keepers movement. It's a very I feel like back in the '90s there was a leader of the Michigan militia. It was, but now it's all just a lot of some of the folks showing up with guns at protests are affiliated with one movement. Some of them are with another movement. Whereas while I think what I'm trying to say is that while the sort of right-wing militia movement looks a lot more dispersed than it did in the '90s, it very much exists, and it's probably even at a higher value than it was more omnipresent. And there's certainly more guns out there than there were in the '90s. I think what Loga is referring to, thanks for the leading questions, Loga, is something that I've talked about a bit, is I think this will end the same way it ended in the 1990s. The right-wing militia movement of the 1990s pretty much evaporated after the Oklahoma City bombing carried out by a guy who's famous, who I will not name because I still don't like to name mass murderers on this channel. Killed, I want to say over 150 people, blowing up a federal building in Oklahoma City. And it was fascinating how the entire militia movement that was, caused much alarm and was super worried about for a very long time, just evaporated. Because people were like, holy shit, like these people are serious and these people want to murder people, and I'm not so interested in doing this anymore. I think, honestly, the fact that there's already been some deaths, I think there's been deaths since June, but I think the rapid fire, strictly ideologically oriented deaths that we've seen over the past couple weeks in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Portland, Oregon, I think it probably gotten a lot of people to think a little harder about showing up for these protests. That would be my suspicion. However, I don't think it's enough. I think what's going to happen is at some point, possibly around the election, maybe a couple months after the election, we're going to have one of these things that goes really, really fucking wrong. We're going to have, I don't know, maybe a bombing, maybe just a full-on shootout that kills a couple dozen people. And I think after that happens, we'll probably have the same thing that happened in the 1990s. I think that this thing will just dry up and blow away. What people don't remember is that before Charlottesville, where just one person died, the sort of alt-right, playing with the white nationalism thing in the early years of Trump's presidency was actually a lot more open and bandied about, and social networks were a lot more open to it. And then the death in Charlottesville sort of clamp things down again. Trump, because an election is coming up, has been acting consciously to spool things up again. I think that this wave of Trump unrest, it's quite possible that it'll end with another Oklahoma City level thing. I mean, that's a goddamn tragedy. If Trump loses, will there be, this is Fado, another super chat, thank you so much. If Trump loses, will there be QAnon terrorist attacks? I don't know that they're going to be QAnon terrorist attacks. I guess my reluctance there is to say that QAnon is like an organization. It's not really, it's just a fucked up, dumb ideology. But will there be some kind of right wing terrorist attacks? I'd say the chances are not low. But and as horrifying as those will be, and heartbreaking as those will be, I think that those are sort of the kind of thing, once again, like the Oklahoma City issue, that would end this era of political horseshit, rather than continue it or make it get worse. So yeah, I think yeah. I mean, who knows? Maybe that's just alarmism. If Trump wins, which I think is very unlikely, would there be left wing terrorist attacks? Maybe. Um, you know, uh, Certainly be more of a reason for those than for the right wing terrorist attacks. But all terrorism is bad. All death is bad. There's no reason to kill anybody ever. Um, do, 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 do. Oh, okay, okay. Let's see. I have Broder. Oh shit, man! I've got three more super chats to get through. I'm sorry. I need to be quicker about this. Okay, Abdiganisugo, where do you think China about? What do you think about China's digital yuan and Facebook's Libra? Thanks for answering my questions. Thank you so much for the super chats, Abdiganisugo. Honestly, I don't know so much about China's digital yuan and Facebook's Libra. I have been pretty suspicious of Bitcoin for a very long. I mean, I remember first reading about Bitcoin on fucking Hacker News back in the mid 2000s and thinking, hey man, I should maybe buy some of that, and I wish I had. But I think I've always been really suspicious of the promise of cryptocurrency, because if you look at it, they're like, we're going to supplant the currencies of the whole world. And if you ever get to do that, you're going to get yourself the target of the militaries of the whole world. I'm not somebody who's like, oh, the petrodollar describes everything or whatnot. But like this idea that cryptocurrency is going to somehow supplant and replace some are going to supplant or replace like the actual currencies of the world is real hard to credit, and always has been. I think Libra is. I haven't read enough on Libra. My understanding is that it's I think largely recognized to have flopped. I do think that there's a scope for cryptocurrency. There's a scope for building new markets, building new this, that, and the other thing. And I think that there's certainly going to be a lot more potential for these sorts of things if they are backed by an entity like China or backed by an entity like Facebook. Unfortunately, my general level of skepticism for cryptocurrencies and like those fundamental promises it makes, like this is going to change everything. God, I remember where was I? I was in San Francisco in like 2017 or 2018 in some discussion somewhere. It was like we were talking about how awful Syria was, and some guy was like, "Well, what if we involved cryptocurrency?" Like I'm just so suspicious of this idea that cryptocurrencies are the answer to everything, that I have maybe to my detriment and the detriment of my analysis. I've sort of consciously laughed off a lot of cryptocurrency stuff, and I think the point at which that changes is absolutely when entities like China or Facebook start getting more behind them. But I haven't seen anything yet that leads me to believe that I should be paying more attention to China's digital yuan or Facebook's Libra. I could be wrong about that. Broder Moment asks, how would the geopolitics of Europe, Turkey, and Russia change if the U.S. began cutting back on military spending and stopped projecting power? Well, that's a very good question. I think that to a degree, I think things would improve dramatically. I think if we weren't projecting hard power in Iraq and Syria, there wouldn't have been a refugee movement. And the EU would be a much more stable, stronger, and even possibly economically growing place if it wasn't for U.S. power projection. Like if the U.S. like completely was like, fuck it, we're done with NATO, have fun. I think probably there's a potential now because things are so fucked up of war between Russia and Ukraine. I think. I don't think there's any possibility of Russia going into the Baltics because it's in the EU, and I think that the destruction of Russia's oil markets in Europe, leaving aside the potential for European power projection, which would grow as they were dealing with the fact that a Russia that has invaded again. Yeah, so honestly, I think things could potentially be bad, but I think that Europe would probably stand on its own 2 feet. Of course, the thing is, the dirty secret from the U.S. perspective, and that Donald Trump is too fucking dumb to realize, is like the whole point of NATO is for Europe to not stand on its own 2 feet, right? Like, because like I like the idea of sort of Russia, wrapping in, the EU wrapping in Russia and becoming this sort of European superstate. But because of a lot of dumb geopolitical analysis, founded by a brilliant and interesting guy who just happened to be wrong about a lot of stuff, named Halford Mackinder, the what's the word? Like the U.S. is obsessed with this idea that Eurasia cannot be controlled by one power, when in fact it's Mahan was right, and it's the sea power and the coasts that are going to have the long term importance. The thing with NATO is that it's also the point of it is to also keep Europe kind of weak. So yeah, I don't think that even if Trump got reelected, I don't think fully abandoning NATO is likely at all. So while yeah, like I don't know, like I think it's possible to imagine like the United States sort of abandoning Europe and Russia invading Ukraine. I don't think it's particularly likely. Maybe the Baltics. I don't think it's particularly likely, but it's impossible to imagine a Russia getting any further than that. And such an invasion would destroy its relationship with the Western European countries that bankroll them and their gas resources. And Western Europe has alternatives for those gas resources now that I don't see that as credible. But I also don't think that the U.S. is going to completely back off its projected hard power. Brando Commando asks thoughts on the recent countries that have normalized relations with Israel and its impact in the region. Will we see more? And if so, who? I think it is possible that you could see Oman or even Kuwait, but I don't think it's likely. And I will be very surprised, and I don't know if I will, but I probably should run a video correcting the UAE Israel thing that I did. I would be tremendously surprised if a real modern Arab country signed a peace deal with Israel this year or the next year. You need to have some kind of monarchy, some kind of dumbass old medieval monarchy that controls enough public opinion to make that happen. I think that's the only real way that you can get more. So Oman is a possibility, though it just would seem strange to me if the new Sultan of Oman was willing for that to be one of his first actions. I don't think Saudi Arabia can do it. I know that Trump and company are pushing super hard, but so much of the legitimacy of the Saudi royal family is wrapped up in opposition to Israel. So I don't think they can do it. And unlike the UAE or Qatar or Kuwait or Bahrain or Oman to a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia has a real population, like a real population that it has to control. Whereas all those other places are just so tiny, and their people, the non-royal family people, are either so comprehensively bought off or crushed that they can get away with it. So I don't think Saudi Arabia can do it. Sudan, which is interesting, tremendously poor country that is desperate for better relationships with the United States. And Mike Pompeo was like, okay, then just normalize relationships with Israel, and we'll take you off the terrorism list, and you're good to go. And Sudan was like, are you fucking kidding me? Or whoever they were negotiating with in Sudan was like, are you fucking kidding me? And it's also really kind of a fucked up thing that the U.S. and Israel are pushing that on Sudan, because it's in a tremendously amorphous, up in the air kind of place politically, and like throwing Israel in there is like really not cool. And my understanding is that most of Netanyahu and the Israeli government's negotiations have been with the strongmen military that are supposed to give up power voluntarily in the next 6 to 12 months. And like I feel like getting in bed with the strongman military, it's just tremendously irresponsible and frankly a little gross that we're trying to push this on Sudan right now. But I don't even with that weird power relation, I don't think that it's happening. So yeah. All right. So I think that's what I have to say about that. Morocco is, I guess, a possibility, but again, I think the Moroccan king is just not likely to do it. Fadel S., have you watched Children of Men? I absolutely have. That is a fantastic film. I remember loving it when it first came out. God, when did Children of Men come out? Like 2008 or something like that. Getting brave and opening other browser windows. Yeah, 2006. I remember initially seeing that in 2006 and being just like blown away. And on a rooftop in Galata in Istanbul, we had this amazing thing with like the Galata Tower in the distance, and then not in the distance, like right by the Galata Tower, and then we had a piece of roof, a piece of wall up on the roof where we could project films. It was really cool. Watched Children of Men in, I want to say, like 2015 or so, as the refugee thing was like really spooling up, and it was just like, holy shit, because there's a lot in Children of Men, this sort of dystopian future thing about handling refugees and refugee detention. And it was just really grim to watch, and I guess it's just getting more grim to watch because Children of Men, of course, is about nobody. The premise of this dystopia is that nobody can have children anymore. And one of the more interesting aspects of, and less commented upon aspects of Trump's America is that fertility, which had already been declining in the United States, fell off a cliff as soon as he was elected. Because young people hate him. And if you think that your country is the kind of person that can elect Donald Trump, you become less willing to have children. So yeah, that's another way. So yeah, it's kind of horrifying that 2006, Children of Men was this like, cool, crazy, really well done dystopian thriller. And then in 2014, it was like, shit, that's a little too close. And it just keeps getting closer. Anyway, so yeah, Children of Men, scary. All right, well, I'm going to, it's been 2 hours, so I'm going to start on my closing spiel, unless, of course, I get more super chats. Super chats can keep me talking. I hate to be so sleazy about this, but I'm going to have to leave my parents' summer house and get an apartment again at some point. So super chats. Anyway, my name is Rob Morris. You have just been watching live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. As I've alluded to, I also do I do 2 of these a month. One is for the general public, which you have just participated in. I'm very grateful to you for participating in. The other one is for just patrons only. And it's the patrons who keep me eating. That's my main source of income is on Patreon. There's a link in the description here. If you sign up for that, you also have access to the monthly live patron-only chats. And in those, it's more of a conversation. We basically have like 10 to 15 people who show up at any given time, and I go through all of the relevant news items for the relevant countries we cover on this channel, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and anything else that comes to mind of me or patrons. Patrons request it. We go item by item. I give my little spiel that I've developed on it, and then we discuss it, and I do like 5 to 10 items. It's a lot of fun. I would love for more people to show up. And you can show up for those. I guess it'll be about 3 weeks until the next one. You can show up for that by signing up for Patreon. In addition, by the end of the year, I will have a patron-only survey, like a poll, that will determine what my next big project is. Basically, every 2 years, it'll maybe 3 years this time around. The last one took a lot out of me. I have a big project that deals with a publication. The first one was on the U.S.-Saudi relationship. It's got a 40 series videos that you can watch. Those are all completely free and always will be, called Everybody's Lying About Islam, about the U.S.-Saudi relationship. It's also got a sort of very thin book that I produced that you can purchase on Amazon. And I would highly recommend that you do that because it's fun and it's quick. My next big project was comparing the U.S. Empire to the British Empire. Produced a very long 400-page book called Avoiding the British Empire. The thing is, with the way that I see the British Empire and the U.S. Empire, that book is like a stealth history of basically the last 200 years of the world, arguing that actually the British Empire is a lot more powerful than is currently recognized, as the US is today a lot more powerful than is currently recognized. So I would highly recommend that book, Avoiding the British Empire. I've also got a series of 20-odd videos available for that for free on YouTube. I got a new super chat, which interrupts my spiel. Fog Niebuhr. So I'm going to talk about this super chat that Fog Niebuhr wants to talk about. Okay. Fog Niebuhr says, the constant liberal media outlet talking point that Trump is a fascist contradicts demands for compliance with establishment institutions and intelligence agencies by the same liberal media outlets. That's a very complicated point that you're making there. I actually have a video that I've half written talking about why I believe Donald Trump to be a fascist. And I believe Donald Trump to be a fascist because of his pardons, frankly, to give a little bit of a preview. Nothing illustrates more directly that Trump believes that there are other parts of the U.S. community and the world community that deserve less protection of law, that deserve to be brutalized, solely for the fact that they are people of a different skin color, a different group, an outgroup that is subhuman and worthy of being destroyed. That's what Donald Trump's politics are. That's what Donald Trump puts forward with the thing that he most directly controls, which is, his pardon power. I'll talk about that in more detail. Do I think that the constant liberal media outlet talking point that Trump is a fascist contradicts demands for compliance with established institutions and intelligence agencies by the same liberal media outlets? I think that's actually a subtle and very good point. I do believe that while Trump is personally a racist and a fascist and is perfectly fine with sort of fascist racist policies, that he's frankly too incompetent to actually carry out. In 2017, I was legitimately worried about what was going to happen to the character of this country with Donald Trump in charge. I am much less worried than I was back then because he's proven to be just worthless at anything. He was not going to be the one to change this country. The question is, and I think the crucial question of the Biden, what I believe to almost certainly be the Biden administration, is how do we sort of Trump-proof the system so that we don't end up with a more competent Trump going forward. But I think what Fog Niebuhr is pointing out, and I think is pretty accurate, is that that the way that the establishment has chosen to fight this fascist, racist, incompetent is both stupid and does not acknowledge the role that establishment played in bringing him to power. The fact that we've just constantly been asked to flip out about Russia instead of looking at the way that a lot of those exact same people who want us to flip out with Russia built the environment that allowed Trump to take power. The fact that CNN and MSNBC are just filled with national security freaks, alumni from the CIA, the FBI, folks who, the NSA, just nightmare people who created the 20-year climate of fear since 9/11 that Donald Trump just did a better job of exploiting than they did. The fact that we're now supposed to listen respectfully to, things that James Comey and Brennan and Hayden and McMaster and all these fucks have to say about national security and what's good for the country is wrong and is insane. Again, ignores the fact that, Trump is there because he took their playbook and is doing a better job of running with it. So yeah, I don't think it's really contradictory to say that Trump is a fascist. I think you say Trump is a better fascist than any of the dumbass fascists that have been, trying to shape the country from the national security state for the past 20 years. Now that's contradictory. I feel like I've contradicted myself because I'm saying Trump is incompetent. I think Trump is incompetent from the perspective of governing and shaping the country. He is, however, much better at rolling with this climate of fear, this political. I mean, it's sort of a knee jerk capability that he has. He is better at drumming up fear because he is less responsible with it. I think a lot of these folks, a lot of Republicans, Democrats know that the fear was useful, to the extent that it got them elected, but they wouldn't actually, try to do a Muslim ban. They wouldn't actually try to, really do anything to change the situation to make the world safer. But they wouldn't. Well, okay, I'm confusing myself a little bit too. This is what happens when you talk for 2 hours. But I think I'm going to leave this topic behind because I got another super chat. So I'm going to keep going. Will birth rates lead to the fall of Europe? I hate toucans, which is a fantastic name. It says, will birth rates lead to the fall of Europe? I always see these ideas floating online, and I wanted to know what you think. I think that falling birth rates is something that we should all be very concerned with. As I said, in the Trump era, the United States has fallen down to European levels, and it never was before. But yeah, we stopped accepting immigrants. And also the people who live here, who were born here, became even less willing in the Trump era to have children because it's awful, because this is what the Trump era is. It's awful. Will birth rates lead to the fall of Europe? No. I think that and I've been mocking this a bit on Twitter and elsewhere, like this whole of will birth rates lead to the fall of Europe? Is Europe about to become Islamic because, they're going to be outbred, neglects the fact that actually the birth rate in Muslim countries is falling a little bit, a decade or two behind, but is falling just as quickly as it is in Europe. And actually France, who for centuries has had problems with, fertility rates, is now actually leading Europe and the Middle East, with some exceptions. But pretty close to leading, Europe and the Middle East with fertility. So yeah, I think the fall of Europe narrative is much more reliant on this idea that they're going to be swamped by Muslim hordes or something like that, and that's simply not going to happen. Put bluntly, because Muslims aren't breeding either. This is also something to keep in mind with, I don't think you see anybody stupid enough to put this forward anymore, but that used to be the idea that Hispanics were going to swamp the United States, and yeah, Mexico and Latin America, and women now reproduce at the same falling level as US folks. Generally, like, the idea of falling fertility is also kind of awesome in some ways, because what it's mostly the artifact of is improving economies and improving rights for women. You don't have, in countries where women have choices, they don't choose to have 7 or 8 women. I say, sorry, 7 or 8 children, because that is awful, and is an incredible imposition. So yeah, where women are free, fertility falls. However, I think we're now reaching a point where fertility has fallen below the point that I think it's fair to say, I can't say fully, not being a woman, but I think below the point where most women would choose to have children. I don't know that that's completely accurate, but I think I know the people I know who don't have children are largely, some of it's through choice, some of it's, but also it's because economic reality just doesn't make it possible. And I'd say that as someone who, largely travels in pretty educated, pretty opportunity-filled circles. It's just real, having a kid's real goddamn expensive in the developed world, and I think that's to some extent that's a policy choice that we've made in the developed world. And I think was it Matt Iglesias, a guy I follow on Twitter, has just put out a book called 1 Billion Americans, and I look forward to reading that because I think he's got talking about pro-natalist policies, which I think are probably a good thing. But also, there's also the thing. I am not something I go into on YouTube very much, but hey, I've been talking for 2 years, so why not start talking about one of my craziest things? Like, I actually do believe, and have been following less so recently, but more in my 20s. Like, I do think that U.S. life extension, not U.S., world life extension of human beings in general is a very real possibility. I do believe that we're making tremendous progress with health and whatnot. There's a million caveats to that. Well, what about child mortality? Actually, most of the right raise in life expectancy is the fall in child mortality, what have you. But no, I do believe that human beings are generally living longer, and I think in the coming decades it will be possible to both live longer and live healthier. So I tend to be like, well, if we're gonna all live another 50 years, then it's only natural that we have, fewer children. It made sense to have 6 to 10 children when 4 of them were going to die. So, 1 or 2 kids or 3 kids, like, makes sense now. So yeah, fertility is a very interesting question that I've talked about a lot, especially considering the fact that I have 3 more super chats to go through. Woohoo! I'm gonna talk forever. Okay, so that's birth rates. Adam Jaber, that's a very generous super chat with no question involved. Thank you. Oh, there we go. Oh man, Adam Jaber, that is a very good question. Wanted to ask, where do you see Israel and Palestine heading? That's a $20 super chat at the 2 hour mark on something that I could talk about for 3 hours, which I'm afraid I will not be able to do. That actually is, I feel bad. Okay, so Israel, Palestine. I think that the security threat to Israel has been more or less quashed. Yet over the past, yet Netanyahu has continued to act as if there's a massive security threat from Palestine, which has led to a level of brutality and a level of cozying up to nasty, shitty medieval monarchs like the UAE and Saudi Arabia people that will eventually have a tremendous backlash on Israel. I don't think people can look at what's happening in Israel and Palestine today and imagine, as they could during the Second Intifada, that there was some more or less rational give and take here. I mean, in the United States, you could say, well, it's fucked up that Israel killed 100 Palestinians for 20 dead Israelis, but there's still 20 dead Israelis. It's a lot harder for the United States and the world in general to say, okay, one Israeli field got burned down and the Israelis killed 1,000 Palestinians. Like that's not a calculus that anybody can accept anymore. So I think the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government are sort of relying on things to be seen as victories that would have been seen as victories in the 1990s or the 1980s, or certainly in the 1970s or 60s, like cozying up to Saudi Arabia. Sure, in the context of the Cold War and like a terrorist Palestinian liberation organization that was, seriously threatening, a number of things. Yeah, that would have been a tremendous victory. But now it's like the 2020s, where Palestine is just generally like a put upon, apartheid half state without much real involvement in terrorism. And, Israel's just trying to set up an apartheid state. I think that Israel is going to wake up in the next 5 to 10 years and be like, holy shit, we don't have a lot of support anymore. Now, let me qualify that. Like, it is never going to get to the extent where the United States, as I think some people imagine, that like, ooh, well, when the Israel lobby gets exposed and people start caring about Palestinian lives again, then U.S. isn't going to support Israel anymore, and that's not true. It's probably a series of videos I'll do some point, but there are many, 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 many reasons that the United States supports Israel, going far beyond lobbying or whatnot. So the United States, I believe, will always support Israel's continued existence and independence and survival. However, the blank check to brutalize and maintain an apartheid population, I do believe that that's going to become a lot less unquestioning in the United States. And I think that's going to have some very real consequences for Israel going forward that the Palestinians could profit from? Does this mean that the two-state solution is dead? I don't know, man. It's hard to say. Because I think what happened was Netanyahu was like, all right, cool, we're annexing stuff, which basically means like the two-state solution is dead. And then the fucking New York Times, which is I don't want to be too stereotypical here, but yeah, like it is not generally considered to be a Israel unfriendly newspaper. The New York Times and other places ran things were like, okay, two-state solution's over. Time to give the Palestinians the vote in Israel. And then that was not I do not think that is the response that the Israeli government wanted from the New York Times. Supposedly the New York Times is super liberal, but the New York Times has always been very pro-Israel. So I think like, yeah, they're like, oh, okay, we're not going to annex Palestine because, the UAE agreed to it, whereas they probably weren't going to annex these Palestinian lands anyway, because they were a little surprised by the vehemence of the anti-annexation reaction. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a very deep question. We are at 2 hours and 20 minutes. I hope that was okay. Thank you for your tremendously generous super chat of $20. I will say that, yes, obviously, at the end of the year, I'm going to do a poll where I decide what my next big, like, everybody's lying about Islam or avoiding the British Empire size project is going to be. And I think absolutely one of the options will be finally doing the necessary reading to talk seriously about the history and the potential of the Israel-Palestine issue, which I know is something that people have requested a lot, and I've historically tried to avoid because they are such small countries. And also, I have a range of opinions that are guaranteed to enrage supporters of Israel and enrage supporters of Palestine. So that's just sort of like a, no win for me, unless, of course, a significant mass of my patrons vote for it. So that's what that's about. Matt, you have retracted your question. Okay. I mean, like, will there be two-state or largely led by Netanyahu and their predecessors? I think so. Matt, I think, had another question about Israel-Palestine that I hope I kind of addressed in that last spiel. Brando Commando, we have another $5 super chat. Thoughts on the war hawks who lied us into Iraq and are all backing Biden? Not a fan of Trump's foreign policy, but I fear that under Biden, the U.S. will go back into Syria. I am terrified of that. I think that is a very legitimate thing to be afraid of. I think that's a real goddamn shame that Biden is surrounding himself with idiots who think that maybe we should invade Syria and start another $1 trillion nightmare. I think that's a very legitimate concern. However, I think that if Trump stays in power, we're guaranteed to get another $1 trillion nightmare with Iran. I made a video on that extent. With his assassination of Soleimani, Trump has basically already started a $1 trillion war with Iran. The only question is whether or not Trump leaves power, and then maybe we can get back to an understanding with Iran without another $1 trillion nightmare. What was very interesting, I tweeted, and we were discussing on Twitter. There was what looked like a really great opinion piece from Biden in CNN talking about, hey, like, we got to get back in this deal. And I thought they were going to, the Biden people were probably going to dick around with the Iran nuclear deal for a while. But no, I mean, he's like making it like part of his election campaign. We're going to hop back in the deal. I think that's fantastic. And I think dramatically lessens the chances of the Iranians responding to our assassination of Soleimani in a serious way, which, of course, the U.S. military-industrial complex also was releasing suspicions of a plot to assassinate a U.S. ambassador, which I think would be, like a proportional response to what we did to them with Soleimani. Obviously, I'd be against it, but yeah. Anyway, okay. But yeah, so like, I think that, yeah, I think it's true. I think it's distinctly possible that the Biden administration would have people who would waste more American lives and trillions of dollars and obviously Syrian lives. It's amazing how reflexively racist I can be. like wasting all that money. So I think it's a tragedy, but I think under a Trump administration, it's guaranteed to happen. Because yeah, the war with Iran will not happen in Iran; it'll happen in Syria and Iraq. I'm hoping that they're just blowing smoke in the Biden administration, and there are enough people because it's important to point out that while Obama and his administration did destroy Syria, they did not, do a full-on invasion after learning the lesson of Libya. I got to hope that there are some people who feel similarly in Biden's administration. So yeah, so the Trump administration, you got guaranteed destruction of Iraq and Syria. Biden, you've got likely to maybe destruction of Syria. So yeah, I think Trump's still the better bet. But yeah, I think it is as soon as Biden wins, as I hope he does, you're going to see a lot of what Biden should do, and a lot of complaints about people that he puts into his administration from this channel. Yeah, I'm going to be very vocal about that very quickly. But at the end of the day, I still believe that it is worth it to get Trump out. Okay, Alan asks with a very generous super chat that will keep me going. What are your thoughts on the most current anti-corruption protests in Tripoli and Benghazi? And do you think democracy will likely prevail in Libya? I'm embarrassed to admit I saw that there was some kind of progress with Libya over the past 3 or 4 days, and I have yet to read it. I think what I have read recently about Libya is there's been a lot of tension within the Government of National Accord. This is the Turkish and US and United Nations sponsored, supposedly official government of Libya that has just pushed back and an offensive from the Russian, Egyptian, UAE, Saudi, French-backed House of Representatives government in Tobruk, sort of controlling Benghazi under Haftar. Do I think democracy is likely to prevail? I don't know. I haven't read enough about that. The crazy thing is, like, what little I read was it seemed like they were choosing a unified government between the GNA and the LNA. I find that hard to believe. What I find more likely is sort of the GNA and the HOR. Sorry if all these acronyms are not making much sense. I have been doing this for 2.5 hours. I'm going to hope that Alan knows what I'm talking about. I don't think that democracy is likely to prevail. I think what's likely is to be some kind of negotiated status will be put together with an eye towards elections in a year or so. At that point, democracy might be able to move forward. Of course, how that actually works is hard to say. I think Libya is tremendously complicated. I think it is a happier place for Haftar not successfully crushing everybody else in the place. But I just don't know what it's going to look like going forward. I am not as up to date on Libya as I perhaps should be. We may be reaching the point of diminishing returns on what I can do here at 2.5 hours in. Thank you so much for the generous super chats. I think I'm going to do the last one and then spiel and then peel off. Darth Vader asks, do you think Turkey will be Syria 2.0? And my answer is no. I think that I did a video on this specifically, probably a year back at this point. Sorry, why the conspiracy against Turkey keeps failing. Turkey is A, too rich, and B, too not oil-oriented. That combo of the two for the relationship with the United States to be permanently destroyed. Because Turkey decided to purchase some S-400 missiles from Russia, they did manage to finally put their relationship with the United States in serious jeopardy. But that was just one of many business interests that has a stake in Turkey. Turkey is, I think, are they quite? No, I don't think they're quite over $1 trillion economy yet. But that is a huge, huge piece of economic weight. I think Syria's GDP, when the decision was made to destroy the place, was like $20 billion or something like that. It's comparatively tiny. Turkey is a bigger economy than it's huge, and there's tremendous investments. You know, like Raytheon will be like, I want to destroy Turkey, and McDonald's will be like, you can't fucking do that. I got a lot of restaurants there, you know, and Ford, you know, makes a lot of cars there. So these are the reasons that I think Turkey is not in that class of countries like a poor country like Syria or a rich country that's rich because of oil that can be stolen. So yeah, I do not see, no matter how desperately Greece may want it, or France may want it, I do not see Turkey eventually being put into this. Russia's kind of instructive here, actually. Whereas, so the Russian economy is like not quite double the Turkish economy, I think. But Russia, you know, you hear all this stuff about these ruinous sanctions we put on Russia, yada, 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 after the Ukraine thing. And it's like, well, you know, certain things were sanctioned, certain government officials were sanctioned, certain parts of the government were sanctioned. But generally, you know, most of the business still is conducted between Russia and the rest of the world because there's just a lot of money there. And I think Turkey has enough money involved in its economy that a real, like, full on attempt to destroy it the way we destroyed Syria is not going to happen. Okay, man, so many more questions. I need to stop. Okay, I hate to, but I'm so grateful for these super chats. I hate Toucans. What do you think the future relations will be between Turkey and Europe? Is there still a chance for Turkey to join the EU? I mean, is there a chance? Yeah, like I actually, you know, in my fantasies, I see like Russia and Turkey joining the EU at about the same time because they would sort of balance each other out. Yeah, but that's obviously like decades into the future. Yeah, I do not see, obviously, I don't see the EU accepting Russia or Turkey under Putin or Erdogan, or under, you know, if, you know, Ekrem Imamoglu and Alexei Navalny became, you know, the leaders of Turkey and Russia over the, you know, next week, and they were just, you know, awesome, 100% progressive neoliberal, you know, jumping through all the appropriate European hoops, it would still be a couple decades before the European Union needs to get back up on its feet before anybody can. They need to figure out how to make economic growth happen again. There are a lot of things that have to go right for Turkey, for the European Union, before any kind of expansion is possible. And there are also very serious political changes that need to be made in Turkey and Russia before that's a possibility either. But yeah, I think to answer your question, I hate Toucans, the fact that I'm all talking about the purely fantastical and nobody else is suggesting possibility of Russia joining the European Union at the same level as I'm talking about Turkey joining the European Union should give you an indication of how far off I believe that possibility. Fadel says, how can the U.S. rebuild its relationship with sub-Saharan Africa in a post-Trump world after the blatant racism from Trump? I think the U.S. has really fucked up its relationship with sub-Saharan Africa on levels far beyond Trump's relationship. It's something I've been researching a little bit recently, just trying to figure out what the hell's going on. It seems like every 6 months we get this new, oh my gosh, you know, Islamic State and jihadism is resurgent in, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, and that's why we're pouring all this money into it. And that's all we hear about it because nobody can afford to send reporters there anyway. I think there are much more seriously fucked up things in sub-Saharan Africa than just Trump's racism. Honestly, I think voting out Trump probably will be a very helpful way of dealing with Trump's racism for a lot of places. Obviously, the fact that the United States did, elect a Donald Trump will always, be, or at least for a generation, be a reason for countries to trust us less. I guess, unfortunately and fortunately for the United States, sub-Saharan African countries are poor enough that really, they're not looking to stand on points of pride with the United States very often, and are most often run by, not most often, but are often run by, sort of dubious dictators who are looking for weapons and training from the U.S. military, which is a very serious problem with sub-Saharan Africa that I don't understand so much. All right, well, okay, I'm going to spiel, and then I am going to, I think, end the stream. As I have pointed out, you can make a donation to the More Freedom Foundation, which, keeps me eating, will hopefully get me out of my parents' summer house. At Patreon, you can sign for that's like an ongoing crowdfunding thing, or you can just do a one-time donation at PayPal. I'd be very grateful for either. And if you do the Patreon, you get access to the other live stream, much more intimate conversation between brilliant people through Patreon, the other live conversation I do every month, and also the ability to vote on my next new project in December or maybe January. Probably December because I think I promised by the end of the year. So that's Patreon. I can be found on Twitter at RoboLaw every day. There are many folks who participate in this chat, and we talk about the issues of the day over on Twitter. At RoboLaw is where I can be found. I'm also on Instagram at The Golden Age. I've been doing more promoting of my video stuff on there, mostly as a preliminary for hitting up Instagram at The Golden Age. And I'm here every Tuesday, usually with a more produced video, sometimes a long live chat like this, at my YouTube channel, More Freedom or Mo Freedom Foundation. I have a website at www.morefreedomfoundation.com. Is there anything I'm missing? Any good pitching I should be doing here? I think that's pretty much everything. And thank you. 78 of you are still here, after 2.5 hours of me bloviating. And I'm very grateful. I am tremendously grateful for all the super chats. I think that, I think this may be a record. And I'm very grateful. And yeah, thank you to all of you. It is you folks that make the More Freedom Foundation possible. I would not be able to do this without the support of all of you, and I'm very grateful. Man, 2 hours 40 minutes. I think I've made up for the 20 minutes that we lost on the patrons only one last weekend. Anyway, thank you so much. Grateful to all of you, and with that, I'm going to end the stream. And I'm also really grateful this worked out. Did not have any disruption. Huzzah!